Brandy had previously told you what a school board is, and I just want to say that, whenever working with your school board, it's important to know whether they are appointed or whether they are elected. And depending on what state you're in, it may be one or the other. And we'll talk about more in terms of why that's important when it comes time for you to take action. So as it relates to the chain of command, in addition to the school board, I think it's important to know that we have principals, and the principal is the administrative and professional leader of the school. And as such, he or she is directly responsible to the superintendent for its successful operation. The major effect of the principal is in the field of educational leadership and both supervision, with the stress on the importance of teaching and learning. So then the principal in turn answers to the superintendent. The superintendent is the top executive or the CEO of the school district. The superintendent implements the school board's vision by making day-to-day decisions about educational programs, spending, staff, and facilities. The superintendent hires, supervises, and manages the central staff and the principals. And the superintendent, in turn, reports to the school board. Go ahead, Brandy, I'm sorry.
Oh, go ahead.
Now we want to just talk a little bit about what is a school board's duties. And one of the most important duties of the school board, and the central thing that most school boards work on, is policy. The school board is tasked with adopting rules and policies that govern school employees and students. All school districts have hundreds of board policies because every process and operation in the school district is governed by school board policy. And so it's important that when you're advocating before a school board, you understand the policy that's related to the thing that you're advocating. And so we wanted to go over some of the duties of the school board. So in addition to setting and establishing policy, the school board also adopts resolutions. Resolutions consist of a description of the history and facts behind the issue that gives rise to the resolution, and in addition to it setting forth the district's proposed course of action. One of the also very important functions of a school board is the appointment of the school district superintendent. We spoke previously that the superintendent answers to the school board. So the school board has one of the sole functions of both hiring and in some instances firing the superintendent. In addition to that, the school board oversees the spending and the financial health of the school district, which is very important. All expenditures that is done under the direction of the superintendent must be approved by the school board at some point. The school board is also responsible for the approval of all personnel recommendations. Now, while a school board does not have a right to designate who gets hired in terms of teachers and principals and district staff, all those hires are made through a recommendation by the superintendent. The school board does have a right to either approve or disapprove those recommendations. The school board is also responsible for reviewing various disciplinary recommendations. Now, the types of disciplinary recommendations that are reviewed by the school board is based on the school board's policy. And most school districts, the school boards are tasked with especially approving any recommendation for expulsion. So if a child is recommended for expulsion by the principal, that decision then gets reviewed by the superintendent. The superintendent then makes a recommendation whether that child then gets expelled. That decision then, or that recommendation, has to be approved or disapproved by the school board. The school board can approve a recommendation for expulsion, they can reverse a recommendation for expulsion, or they can reduce a recommendation for expulsion. And then school board is also responsible for reviewing all recommendations for disciplinary procedures that involve personnel. If a teacher, a principal, administrative staff is disciplined in some way, they have a right to appeal that decision. That appeal then goes to the school board, and so the school board has the final say on any recommendations that the superintendent makes. And just like disciplinary actions, the school board can determine to approve or uphold the decision of a superintendent around personnel disciplinary actions. They can reverse the decision of a superintendent, or they can change, amend, or reduce a recommendation made by the superintendent.
School board members make important decisions that affect children's lives and education. As Kim mentioned, policy is one of the most important ways that the school board is active in our children's lives. School board policies are created several ways.
We discussed previously that there are hundreds of policies that the school board implements. There's several ways that policies come before the school board. First is new legislation. So whenever your senators and representatives go to the Capitol each year and they have their education agenda, they make decisions about laws that impact and affect school districts and education policy in the state that you live in. Those laws then trickle down to each individual school district in that state, and the school district board has to make sure that their policies align with and comply with the laws that are being introduced and adopted on the state level. Another way that school board policies are created is through a review of the current policies. So all school boards are required to review all of their current policies in order to determine whether they, so in fact, for instance, new legislation. This past year, the state of Mississippi, where I am, decided that it was going to change how long a school district could suspend a child. So previously it was up to 45 days, well, it was reduced to 30 days. So our policy at that point was that expulsion in our district could occur up to 45 days, not expulsion, I'm sorry, suspension. Once that law was changed, we had to go back and amend our current policy to align with the new legislation. And so now it reads that that suspensions cannot be more than 30 days. So those are the types of ways that new legislation can impact or change board policy. I was saying that there was a second way that policies are created in school boards, and that's in terms of the reviewing of current policies. So although we have hundreds of policies, every school board meeting has some form of current policies on the agenda. Now, each school board will decide how it will review old or current policies. And based on their policy of reviewing policies, that's kind of how the procedure happens. But every school board has to have a way of reviewing current policies. Our policies are generally reviewed based on what the hot topics are, or board members then decide or discuss what we want to see. So we have a lot of flexibility according to our policy to really make calls on which current policies we want to review on our school board. But that is different from school board to school board because each school board has to set a policy around how it reviews its current policies. Another way that school boards create policy is for the needs. So different things come up that you don't currently have a policy on. Every time something comes up or concern or an issue, the first thing that as school board members that we ask is, what is our policy on that? And if someone says, oh, we don't have a policy, then it has to be a decision whether a policy is needed. So for instance, the era of drones started. You know, children and adults started purchasing these drones. Those are the devices that fly over. I know you've seen them. And the military has used them. Well, now they're popular in terms of both children and adults use them now. And so we were having sporting events like football games, and the children and their parents would bring these drones to the game and fly them around over the football field. And of course, that's a huge distraction and it caused a lot of issues. And so we went back to the school board and we implemented a policy saying that both drones were prohibited at any of our athletic events. So that's kind of one example of how a new need comes up to set policies, because prior to there being drones, that was not a need. But after it became a distraction and an issue, and even in one instance, it injured a football player on one of the fields, we felt the need to start a new policy, so it was developed as a result of that. And then the final way that school board policies are created is because of some form of a request. Someone comes to the school board and says, you know, you want to think about maybe implementing or changing this policy. And that request sometimes comes from parents, it comes sometimes from students, sometimes it comes from community members, and sometimes it comes from the superintendent or other personnel of the school district. One great example of that is cell phone usage. We kept getting teachers having accidents or incidences while they were driving and texting and causing liability for the school district. And so we had to set a policy that said that if you are driving during business hours, or especially if you're driving a district vehicle, that you could not text, and to do so would be a violation of the policy. So we set a policy saying that, of course, you couldn't text and drive, but in the event that you were caught doing that, then we also, the policy includes what the penalty would be or the disciplinary action would be as a result of doing that. So we wanted to give you, also need to understand and talk about how policies are adopted and amended. Just wanted to go through what the flow looks like. So the first thing I think you need to understand is that School board policy, again, how it's done is based on the school board's policy. So there's a policy around how you adopt and implement policies. So in the school district, that the board that I sit on, it started by what I call examination. So you examine the policy. So every school board meeting, there's a list of policies that we're going to examine. Some new policies because of legislation, some current policies that we're reviewing, and others may be a proposal from someone for a new policy. But either way, we would get those policies and we would examine them. After we would examine the policy, we then would have a dissemination period. So the superintendent would be responsible for disseminating that policy within the school district to the personnel, to students. They had to have a system to disseminate the policy to all parents. And then most importantly, to disseminate the policy to the general public. So anytime there is a new policy being proposed to either be amended, reviewed, or developed, the public, everyone had an opportunity to review the same policy that the board was reviewing. After the policy is disseminated, we then have a comment period where either parents, students, community members, whomever has an opportunity to review the policy, but also give us their comments, whether they supported the policy, whether they opposed the policy, whether they had proposed changes to the policy. This was their opportunity to give us their input and feedback so that we can consider that when we decided on the policy. After the review or comment period happens, the superintendent was responsible for gathering all of these comments and providing them to the board. And as board members, we would review or deliberate around the policy based on the comments that we received. Once we went through the deliberation period where we would literally have a discussion at the school board meeting in the presence of the public, we would then have the period where we would adopt the policy. So one board member would make a motion to either to approve or to adopt the policy, and then we would take a vote. Sometimes, even after we've deliberated and discussed, when the vote is taken, we get enough votes to approve it, and sometimes it didn't go through. And so if we don't get enough votes to approve it, then the policy has to go back through the examination phase and come back through the chain, or sometimes the policy just dies and it's not implemented at all.
Okay, before we get into how to advocate and take action, let's pause for a moment and see if there are any questions. If you have any questions, you can type them up in the chat box. Okay, Kim, we have one question so far. Can teachers advocate for a change in policy?
Yes. Now, I must say that I have seen some school districts that attempted to temper teachers' abilities to advocate for policies. I do know that was a First Amendment issue, and ultimately it was determined that teachers do have a right to advocate for policies, because in addition to being a teacher, they're also a citizen. They're a paying citizen. They're the general public, just like anyone else. So yes, teachers have a right to advocate for policies, and a good school board wants teachers' input, because teachers are on the front lines of the field. You know, they're the ones teaching the students, and they are there day to day. So no one knows better than the teachers what the school district needs, or what other policies are needed, or what policy needs to be changed. So we really took teachers' comments and feedback about the potential policies to heart, because of course we want our teachers happy, we want them to be efficient, we want them to be productive. So yes, not only do teachers have a right to advocate for change in policy, I think they should.
Maria, does that answer your question? Great. Okay, we have another question. As a parent, we are not familiar with school policies. What is the best way to ask about policies?
That's a great question. So every school district has policies. So depending on what state you're in, some states require school districts to post on their website a way for the general public to access policies. So in Mississippi, that is a requirement. In other states, it may not be required, but you have, oh, you're in California, you have a right to have possession of that policy. So what I would ask either an advocate or a parent to do is just write your school district, write a letter to the superintendent saying that I want to see the policy on, but you need to be specific, because there are hundreds of policies. And if you don't know what policy you need, then you may want to write the superintendent and say, I would like to see copies of the index of district policies. And what it'll do is it'll give you a whole list of all of the different policies there. And then when you identify the one you want, then I would write the superintendent again saying, I would like to have a copy of X, Y, and Z policy. It is a public record. Anyone is entitled to a copy of it. And once you write your superintendent telling them what they want, they must give that to you. Now, generally, depending on your freedom of information laws would determine how long they have to provide that to you. And there may be a small or a slight fee for receiving those papers, like for copying each page, but you are definitely entitled to a copy of policy.
And if you have specific questions about your jurisdiction, at the end of our presentation today, we'll give you some contact information. You can reach out to us and we can try to help you find that information. We have another question. Can board members advocate particular policies?
Can board members advocate for particular policies?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, that's what board members do. So I know that in my school district, in terms of discipline, we were one of very few states that still allow corporal punishment, for example, but I did not want that in my school district. And so we just recently eliminated corporal punishment in our school district. Most schools in this state still have and implement that, but that is no longer allowed in my school district. So as a board member, I advocated for that policy and I proposed it and was able to get it. I think as a board member, you have a lot more influence because your fellow board members tend to respect your opinion and we work together well. So yes, you board members can definitely advocate for policies.
Okay, we have a few more questions coming in. Can the public ask to have policies created? For example, there's no written policy on how our district manages vendors and they're doing a poor job. You could talk a little bit about the vendor relationship as well.
Yes. Oh, yes. That's a huge issue in most district consultants and vendors and things like that. We call them consultants here. First of all, I would not assume that there's no policy. I would first ask. I would make a request for the policy. And once you make a request and they say that there is no policy, then the second thing I would do is I would then try and do some research around maybe other places that have policies around how to manage vendors and find a policy that maybe you like. And once you find a policy that you like, it just kind of give you an example of a go-by that you can use and you can change it up. But yes, the public can ask to have policies created. And we're going to talk a little bit later about how you get on the school board agenda. And so at that point, I can tell you a little bit more about how to do that. But once you have a policy that you want the school board to consider, you then do what you have to do to get on the school board agenda. We'll talk about how to do that a little later. And then you present your policy to the school board and you give your reasons why you think this policy is important. And then the school board would then consider based on that, well, they'll go through whatever their policy is. So for instance, in my school district, we would go through the dissemination period. We would get comments from the public and the teachers and everyone, and then we would make a decision. So yes, anyone can propose a policy to the school board.
This ties in well to the next question we have, which is what's the time frame for receiving a copy of a policy? Is it district based? Is it state based?
So it's really state based. So there has to be a district policy or there should be, on how long they have to respond to the public's request, not just to policies, but any documentation from the school. So like you're entitled to a copy of your school's budget. It's a public entity. So any public school, most documentation, as long as it's not personnel or confidential student records, anyone in the public is entitled to a copy of it. It's really based on your state's FOIA laws, and I do not know what the FOIA law is for California. I can look it up pretty easily. So Sheila, if you want to, and maybe we can give them an address, Brandy, to send us her request for information via email to us, and I will be glad to look that up for you, Sheila, and then I can tell you exactly what your timeline is, and I might actually be able to pull up the law around making a public records request that can give you some more information about what they should do. And most times it'll also tell you if they ignore you or fail to respond. They oftentimes ignore parents or public because most people don't know how to force the issue when they don't do it. But that law should also tell you who you contact and how you complain in the event that they do not respond to your request.
Okay, Kim, are school board policies changed each year or revised, or does review of policy only take place as issues come up?
It depends. Every school district is different. And so, so for instance, in our school district, we have a policy that says that we're currently reviewing old policies, but I also know a lot of school districts that don't, like their policies are so old. And to be honest with you, most times policies are not addressed until something comes up. You know, it's like we're reactionary rather than being proactive. A good board will constantly review its policies on an ongoing basis, but there are a whole lot of boards that really don't address policy until until something comes up, and then all of a sudden we have to worry. You know, something's going to always come up, but I think the best approach is to be proactive. But I must admit, most school boards are reactive.
Are school boards required to televise meetings? Is there a requirement for this?
No. So televising meetings are not required, and this is true across the entire nation. I do know that a lot of local school districts or localities, cities, provide that functionality. Like a lot of places, you have like a little local channel where you can see the city council meeting and the school board meetings and things of that nature. But that is really a courtesy. It's not a requirement. What they are required to do, though, is because school board meetings are public meetings, people from the public have a right. They have to have it in a place where people can come and watch the school board meeting. You have a right to observe the proceedings, but no, there's no right for it to actually be televised. But you can actually be present, and they have to.